Jazz is one of the most complicated and challenging music styles for young musicians to grasp, but anybody can learn jazz, and it all starts with a good understanding of phrasing and articulation in the jazz world. Let's start with talking about the concept of swing, which is something used to describe swung eighth notes, which um, in the mind of a musician just is something that we hear and can try to replicate, but you can also think of it in a number of ways. Something that I read recently that was um, very good for me, especially to visualize and keep track of in my mind, was to envision a clock where every beat happened when the little hand reached the 12, and the end of that beat happened when the little hand reached the 6 of the clock. So you can sort of imagine there would be a click and then another click very slowly, but then that would be followed by the the following or the preceding eighth note on the 6 o'clock area. So to visualize swing, you can imagine based on which how fast the tempo is, that the swing note is going to hit a certain part of the clock. So when you're thinking about 80 beats per minute or less than that, we're talking around the 9 o'clock area. So you can think there's a click and click. It comes very quickly because the tempo is slower. The swing feel is a little bit different. But if you speed that up and use a metronome, it's easier to hear. And around 100 and 130 beats per minute, that's kind of the more common zone of beats per minute or of tempo for a lot of tunes, and that's where you get that triplet feel, that da 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 da, kind of similar to how I just played, something like that. But triplet, 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 triplet. Even though what I was playing could still be played, I was still thinking in 4/4 time. I was just thinking about the triplets over that. Or if you wanted to visualize a clock, you could think of it as that swung eighth note falling on the 8 o'clock area. So it would come a little bit quicker, and it comes a little bit quicker the faster the tempo. So after 130 beats per minute, it might come around the 7 o'clock area, and then at 181 beats per minute, which is pretty fast. That's when things start to, it's very difficult to swing, especially if you're a guitar player. And that's when things just become kind of your vanilla eighth notes, Yeah, it's not very, it's not very easy to swing at that tempo, but yeah. So swing is an important factor in jazz performance for a number of reasons. If you play things square, if you play things without swinging your eighth notes, it's very noticeable. Although stylistically, you could play part of a line. Maybe after a line of triplets, you can play something like that if you were to take a solo or put a spin on a melody part. But for the most part, when you're reading these whichever instrument you are, when you're reading this chart, uh, it's important to consider swing first and foremost. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is accents on notes. So in the mind of a guitarist, it's very easy to forget about stuff like that because we're not doing something so homegrown and as you know, in hands-on as a horn or a wind instrument player, where things like this is kind of bread and butter. So it's important, especially for the main melody instruments and the main harmony instruments as well. Certainly lead alto, lead tenor saxophone, lead trumpeter, or lead trumpet player, to know these parts of music. So some examples of accents would be falls, duets, scoops that kind of look like a little ramp up. These are things that you'll learn with time, um, but they're pretty self-explanatory. It's just important to, and I'll say this a lot, definitely listen to the other players in your ensemble or in your combo or your group, and you know, here if you're not sure, listen to them, because eventually you're gonna want to align and synchronize and get all that good stuff in. And another popular accent is the ghost note. You'll see that like a little note written in parentheses. That's kind of an important one because it's not really a note. It's kind of like a nuanced thing. It's a technique for me. You know, it's hard to perform right away, but when it's on a chart, it's kind of there for a reason. You're gonna want to take that into consideration, and that leads me into the next point of conversation about swing and about accents is getting into the actual articulation. The Now we know how to play the rhythm, the swing. Now we can work on playing the notes, which is easier said than done. So the term that comes to mind is legato, and I've heard it be described as very fluid, as very kind of connected. Take for example, you could play something like. That was kind of an extreme, hyperbolic example of what you don't want to do on any instrument. If your instrument sounds disjointed and there's a lot of space between notes, stylistically that might be something that you'll do eventually, but for the most part, you're gonna want to take all those notes and just swing them. Something like that, and keep them all. There's like a little call and response where one note flows into the other, which we'll get into when we talk about articulation. So, articulation is especially for wind instrument players that use reeds and use different keys. Stuff like this is important to consider after you consider swing and you consider the accents that you'll see on the charts. And the best way I can describe it is that there's kind of a sort of a syllable. There's a little bit of a consonation going on where you can play one note and then the following one is going to kind of give some supplement, sort of give some stimulation to the next note and then the note following it. So, and then of course for an appropriate jazz tone, you're gonna want to sort of engineer your instrument to do that as best as possible by getting your instrument to sound kind of very very what's the word I'm looking for? Very warm, very something that you can hear very clearly. For a guitar player, that warm tone, that's something that guitar players know a lot about. Maybe are a little bit too obsessed with sometimes, but yeah, it really proper jazz tone really lends itself to creating a good a good legato sort of articulation style, and yeah, you'll hear a lot of things like that, especially from professional wind instrument teachers who will teach you how to really play legato over a swing chart or any other chart in jazz in the jazz lexicon, which is very vast. So what I say, take what I say and what your teachers say with a grain of salt, because like what I'm saying is right, but Anyway, I'm diverging from the articulation subject. So there's certain vowels and there's D and well there's not those aren't vowels. There's certain consonants in music. There's ta ta ti ta. You might have heard that to enunciate the basics of rhythm, and T in that sort of way sort of symbolizes a stronger attack. And in jazz, we use d instead. So when we're talking about articulation in a certain phrase of a jazz chart, we're going to use certain syllables that start with the letter D to emphasize the fact that, rather, or even worse, it's a little bit easier to hear on a horn instrument, I think, because they do most of the heavy lifting, if I'm being honest. So horn players are gonna know these articulation this articulation literature. So we have do. Do is what we use to describe a quarter note on the first and the third beats, and they're also going to be marked with a tenuto marking, which just looks like a little dash above the note. So do it's gonna be like the first quarter note preceding another eighth note, or the first quarter note or first eighth note preceding another eighth note. So then we have da, which would be the following eighth note or any quarter note on 2 and 4, and also any quarter note or any note marked with an accent, which looks like an arrow facing the way that the music is going. That's the best way I can describe it. And you've probably seen and played many tunes that have an accent mark. So da da, when you hear da, it's like you're playing through it. That's how I've heard it be used. That's the context I've heard it used in, and you'll hear it a lot. Then you have dot. Dot has a T sound at the end. So when we were talking about these letters, when we were talking about these consonants that we use in music, T represents, of course, sort of sudden and sort of a shock and awe sort of thing. So we use that at the end to describe any note marked with a top house accent, which looks like an accent marking, but turned upwards, so you can tell right away that that's a dot marking. That's also any note that's preceding a rest. So if there's a eighth note rest, or even a half rest, then that note's going to have the dot. It's going to have the dot syllable or phrase or articulation literature. Then we have dit. That's the last one. These are the four main ones, and that'll be joined together with any note that has a staccato marking, which is just a little dot. And it's called dit. It has a T at the end because it's the dot. It's kind of the exact opposite of the dot in a way. The dot note is going to hold out for longer, but a dit note is going to allow for more space in between each note. So there's gonna be a lot of dits too. Probably not as many as do's and da's, because again, when we're talking about swing, a lot of tunes are going to be in 4/4 time, and it's going to be a lot of swung eighth notes. So an example of this would be just like a little eighth note line. Like, let's say that there are 4 eighth notes at the beginning of the measure, followed by a half rest. Something super duper simple. Maybe the end of a phrase in a passage of the tune. So that would sound like do da, and I said dot because because there's a rest that's following it. So you know that we cut out there, and we know that it stops. But it also, when we say do da, it also helps us visualize or sort of internalize the feeling of swing, especially for the horn players. You wanna hear that, and you're playing, not just when you say do da do da. You want to hear or do da do da. That was a little bit more faithful, and I might not be a very good wind instrument player, but yeah, that's all good information. And then there are only two more things that I'm going to cover, and I know that this is getting a little bit long, but we have balance and blend, which are important in the whole band, for every member of the band. My thing is always listen to the person next to you, but don't just do that. Listen to everybody. That way you can stand more of a chance of trying to fit in that musical space, the soundscape that you're making, which sounds kind of like some sort of like hipster word, like this is our headspace, man. But no, like you wanna find your area of where you're comfortable, and let me give you a better example of this. So I'm a guitar player, so I know a lot about playing guitar, but that doesn't mean that I need to play as much as someone else. And even more, perhaps even more relevant, I don't need to play louder than, say, the pianist. I don't need to play louder than the trumpet players, certainly. So that all goes into perfecting the blend. You also want to pay attention to the bassist for sure, because he or she is always going to be keeping the time guaranteed, and being able to hear the bassist means that the audience probably also has a very good chance of hearing the bassist, especially if everything is set up properly sound wise. But that balance is all about creating the richest sound possible. And then the blend is, which is kind of the brother. It's like the twin brother of balance. If you have a good balance, then you want to have a good blend too. There's never one without the other, especially in professional ensembles where everybody knows what they're doing. So assuming you know what you're doing, you also want to have good tone. You want to make sure you're in tune. You want to make sure that you're not playing too softly. Like if you're a lead sax player, you're gonna want to really belt it. You're kind of like the powerhouse. You're the mitochondria of the uh, of the jazz ensemble, and then everything sort of weaves inward to create that traditional jazz richness, that jazz sound. And of course, I talked a little bit about tone because I got off topic. But it really helps to have a nice warm low end, not more bass and treble tone, no matter which instrument you have, except maybe trumpets. you know, very very bright, very powerful instrument. So, but again, I am not the foremost authority on trumpet playing, but yeah, that just about covers it as far as blend goes. So, anyways, that is all I have on the first and a long line of things to check off your to-do list on learning how to play proper jazz in a jazz ensemble or combo, which would be phrasing and articulation. So, all right, thank you so much.